This book is about the origins of democratic and authoritarian regimes in countries where the military is a significant political actor. Of course, there is a vast literature on the origins of regimes, and when we observe authoritarian regimes and when we observe democratic regimes. And scholars have worked on this for many years, looking at cases and countries from all over the world. But interestingly, this literature has, for the most part, assumed that the military and the military's interests are subservient to the interests of other actors, such as political parties, conservative parties, and right wing parties mostly, and economic interests, such as the aristocracy or the bourgeois. But there is another literature that focuses on civil military relations and military interventions in particular. And that literature has shown us that the military has its own professional and corporate interests that can be different than the interests of other political actors in the system. So this is what I'm trying to do in this book, bring these two literatures together and not only look at the origins of regimes, but also understand the behavior of the military. In particular, I ask why do militaries variously intervene in politics via short-lived coups d'etats, or establish or support longer-term authoritarian regimes, or sometimes come under the control of civilians in a democratic manner? In order to answer these questions, I specifically look at two countries, two neighboring countries, Greece and Turkey. And I call these two countries my natural laboratory because from the 1920s, the interwar period, up until the late 1990s, together these countries provide us with 4 different episodes of authoritarianism, 6 different periods of democracy, and at least 10 short-lived coups with various degrees of success. So looking at all of these cases and different outcomes, I use a framework that was first proposed by Robert Dahl in his 1971 book Polyarchy. In Polyarchy, Robert Dahl argued that we can understand polyarchy, meaning democracy, or hegemony, meaning authoritarianism, by looking at 2 dimensions, the costs of toleration and the costs of suppression. So I adapt this framework to cases where the military is a dominant actor. I argue that officers, politicians, and business people prefer democracy, authoritarianism, or short-lived coups, depending on their perception of the degree to which their interests are threatened by the lower classes or by each other. In that sense, this is the cost of toleration dimension that Dahl was referring to. The fact that the elites and their perceptions of threat are important in determining the preferences of the actors to various different regimes and military interventions. But the costs of suppression are also important, and that refers to the power of the elites when they want to use repressive strategies. That power of the elites is partly determined by the coalitions that the elites form with each other, and in turn this affects the success of the military interventions and the consolidation of regimes. I support some of my arguments in the book with archival research and with secondary literature, but I also support the arguments with 150 interviews that I have done with retired military officers, politicians, and mostly with business people in both Greece and Turkey. I've done this field research over many years and over different rounds of interviews. And I do believe that the book provides an important analysis of both countries, historically and in terms of their contemporary developments. Even though the book is mostly about the history of these countries, I also address the recent economic crisis in Greece and its consequences on its political system. I also talk about the current challenges that Turkey is facing and the regime that is currently undergoing change. In an afterword, because the book was already written, I address the 15th of July 2016 coup attempt in Turkey. Finally, I show in this book that the framework that I adapted from Robert Dahl and used to explain Greece and Turkey can actually be used to explain completely different cases, or cases that seem to be completely different existing in other contexts or circumstances. In one chapter, I adapt the theory to Thailand and Egypt and their more recent military interventions. Currently, Thailand and Egypt have military authoritarian regimes, and I analyze and interpret how we can understand the military interventions in these two countries and the state of their authoritarian regimes. Overall, I think this book would interest students, scholars, and professionals who want to know more about regime change, civil military relations, and certainly the countries that I'm focusing on: Greece, Turkey, Thailand, and